afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another lecture in the series from Learning in Retirement of Palm Desert. My name is Nancy Dowling. I'm a board member of Learning in Retirement Palm Desert, and I'm happy to be here to introduce you and give you a taste of what some of our courses are like. LIR Palm Desert has been around for over 20 years, yet a lot of people haven't heard of it. And we are a nonprofit organization with all volunteer teachers, and every semester or term, we offer 20 to 35 different classes on a variety of topics, from current events to literature to science. We have now a lot of retired physicians teaching classes on medicine, which is an interesting aspect. And we also have language courses and interesting courses like how to write a novel or how to write your life story. Myself, I teach classes on birds as well as literature. So there's a bookmark on most of the chairs. So if you'd like to look at our courses, we're right in the middle of a term right now, but the next term begins at the end of February. So you could go to our website, lirpalmdesert.com, and you could see what our courses are like. Now here's the best part. It's the best deal in town, apart from the $5 glass of wine at Mario's. You can take 5 classes for $45. So we have kind of a bundle pricing. Some of the classes are on Zoom, some of the classes are in person. So again, you can just visit our website and look at the next term's offerings. And we do have a Facebook page as well. You just type in LIR Palm Desert, don't forget Palm Desert, and it will bring you to our Facebook page. So I hope you enjoy today's lecture. Thanks.
Thank you, Nancy. And once again, the Coachella Valley rings true with wonderful opportunities for all of us who get to live, work, play, and enjoy life here. Welcome, good afternoon, and Happy New Year. My name is Patrice Merritt. I am chair of the Rancho Mirage Library and Observatory Foundation. And while I'm here today to introduce today's speaker, I'm also here to remind you to turn off your cell phones. Thank you. The city of Rancho Mirage is very generous in providing us this beautiful facility and a wonderful, stellar staff to assist us with all of our information needs. But programs such as this exist due to the generosity of friends, family, and neighbors who come and visit our community and live here. So for those of you that are looking to make maybe a small contribution, a large contribution, the Library Foundation welcomes denominations large or small, and it is simply a matter of picking up a brochure in the back of the room, visiting a member at a library staff, or simply calling us and going online and making your donation. I thank you in advance, if not for the donation, for every consideration going forward. I take pride today in introducing Mr. Smith for several reasons, one of which is I'm a retired librarian and I'm an avid Harry Truman fan. As a librarian, I have visited most of the presidential libraries and that are located in maybe remote places throughout this great nation, but they are wonderful places to visit. Mr. Smith has done research at 6 of these facilities, and I envy him the opportunity to do that because they can attest, they tell and chronicle our nation's leaders and how each one of them is separate and distinguished, but still has that American spirit. The locations of these facilities are a tourist's delight. Believe me, if you have the opportunity as you travel through this country to go out and visit, take time out of your travel schedule and visit a presidential library. You will talk about it as a highlight of your trip. But today we're here to learn more about our 33rd president, his legacy, and the world-shaping decisions that he made during a very tumultuous time in our nation's history. You will hear how many of Mr. Truman's policies and decisions resonate in today's worldview and how his, and I love this, Harry's fair deal was his guiding principle. Please join me in welcoming Harold Ivan Smith.
Good afternoon. It's wonderful to see you and to have slept in my own bed last night and just driven down 111, and here I am. This is my favorite library. It is a jewel of a library, and I have sat in the audience so many times, so it's different to be up here. But I'm delighted to talk about Harry Truman. I was in the Truman Presidential Library when I lived in Kansas City, waiting to meet Rosalind Carter. And we were standing in a long hallway, and they have these huge, much like these pictures, 3x2 pictures of Harry Truman in black and white. And there was a little bit of a crowd, and so we were waiting, and the man in front of me kept staring at one picture, and then he began crying. And I thought, well, maybe it's okay, whatever. And finally his wife turned to him and said, "What is wrong with you?" in that voice some wives use in public spaces. And he goes, "If it wasn't for that man, I wouldn't be in the world today." And she goes, "What are you talking about? It's Harry Truman. What did Harry Truman have to do with you?" And he said, in 1945 in the summer, I was in the Pacific, and I was going to be in the invasion force to invade Japan. And Harry Truman gave me life. And I came home from the Pacific. I met you. We've had this wonderful children, a wonderful life, and it all is because of Harry Truman. And there are legions of men, and I've buried some of them, who could say the exact same thing. Harry Truman gave them back their lives in either World War II or Korea. All right, we're going to start with April 12th, 1945. FDR dies in Warm Springs, Georgia. Harry Truman is at the Board of Education in the U.S. Capitol. That's not an education board. It was a bar. And that's where you could gather for libations. And, you'd had a rough day legislating, and you could just drink. And so Harry Truman was there, and they said, "Oh, there's a phone call for you." So he takes the call. And Harry Truman says, "Gotta leave, but I'll be back." And off he goes running. In 5:25, he's in the White House. He's ushered upstairs where Eleanor is waiting for him. And she bluntly says, "Harry, the president is dead." And Harry Truman was speechless. Now, he had been vice president for 82 days and had only seen Roosevelt twice in person during those 82 days. And he struggled and finally said, "Well, is there anything I can do for you?" And Eleanor goes, "Do for me? It's what can we do for you? You're the one in trouble now." And then she said, "I do have one request." He said, "What would you like?" She said, "Could you arrange a plane to fly me to Georgia tonight so I can come back with the president's body?" And so sure enough, that was Truman's first order as president to do that. But there was a lag time, and this is hard to imagine in a war. There was a lag time of 2 hours and 24 minutes before, and they could not find the Chief Justice of the United States to swear him in. Now, realize this was primitive phone days, all that kind of stuff. And, well, he left here about this time. He said he was going here, and finally they traced him down. But to Truman's chagrin, they could not find a Bible in the White House. That huge house and no Bible. And that took part of those 2 hours was looking for a Bible. And Harry Truman said, "If you had told me I was going to be sworn in, I would have brought my granddaddy's Bible, but you didn't tell me." And here he is, and you can see Bess in the middle, because she realized their life had been changed just instantaneously, and this was not what she had in mind. It was not just that the greatest of men had died, but it was that the least of men, in many people's opinions, had taken or assumed his place. And one person said, "If Harry Truman could be president, then my next-door neighbor could be president." And David Lilienthal, who was the TVA administrator, was totally chagrined. He said, "This is a great, great tragedy. God help us all. The country and the world don't deserve to be left this way," meaning left with Harry Truman. And he said that the very thought of Truman being president made him physically ill. Now, one thing about Harry Truman, he was very forgiving every night. Every night, from the time he was 17 till his death, he prayed for God to give him compassion, patience, and forgiveness for people who made errors that affected him. And he eventually appointed Lilienthal head of the Atomic Energy Commission. And now, off in Germany, there were three generals drinking, Eisenhower, Bradley, and Patton. It had been a horrible day for them to begin with because they had been in one of the concentration camps and they saw 3,600 naked Jews. And Patton couldn't handle it. He was vomiting everywhere. And that's when Eisenhower said, "Get everybody here. I want everyone to see what they've done to the Jewish people." But Patton was saying, can you imagine, we're going to have to be taking orders now from a mere captain in World War I. What does he know about warfare? And then Patton, as eloquent as he could be, said, quote, "It seems very unfortunate that people are made vice president that are never intended, neither by party nor by the Lord, to be president." Now, how Patton knew the Lord was not interested in Harry Truman is beyond me, but Patton didn't always back up his prayers and his observations. At the 4 p.m. funeral, no one stood when the president walked into the East Room. But Harry just said, "Hey, keep the service going." And, the service only lasted 20 minutes because it was wartime. And at Hyde Park, when the train went overnight, there were limousines for all the important people, and there was no limousine for the President of the United States. So he took a taxi to the grave. And he never griped about it, never said anything about it, just, "I need to get to the grave. Can you take me to the grave, and how much will it cost?" And at FDR's grave, Truman was overwhelmed by the whole thing. He stood there very silently, and there were 1,000 West Point cadets there. And Truman happened to look up, and he broke into a smile, and he met one of those cadets' eyes. It was Jack Capps, that Truman, as senator from Missouri, had appointed to West Point. And after the service, they had an incredible blend of meeting, and General Capps went on to become a general, one of the world's experts on Shakespeare, and he's one of my friends. He's still with us, and just an amazing man. Truman made a great choice for a cadet to appoint to West Point in the 40s. April 16th, Truman went to address Congress. A lot of people were asking, who is this Harry Truman? And a lot of people were asking lots of questions like, couldn't God some way have arranged Roosevelt to live a little longer, at least to see the war end in Europe? And Truman, from Bess's background as Episcopalian, borrowed some of her thinking. In his infinite wisdom, Almighty God has seen fit to take from us a great man who was loved and by all and humanity. Now, that wasn't a true statement, because people were dancing in the streets, just carrying on, in country clubs because Roosevelt was dead. But nevertheless, it sounded appropriate to kind of put the best spin on it. But Truman was emphatic in that moment that the war would only end with unconditional surrender. That is what Roosevelt had said at that very podium in 1941, and he was determined that was the way the war was going to end. So those 120 days were really a seismic shift, with FDR dead, Harry Truman president, the war in Europe ending on May 8th, the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the war in Asia ending on September 2nd with the surrender in Tokyo Harbor, and then the UN's founding in the fall, a formal organization in the fall. Incredible days. Well, you need to know, who was this person? I've been very impacted by a couple of people. One, a theologian, who said, if you want to know somebody, look at their childhood. Try to figure out what were the antecedents in their childhood. And fortunately, Harry Truman's are very great. This is his mother and father, Martha and John. Martha is standing because she was taller than John. And the photographer thought it wouldn't look good if, so anyway, they had her stand, and there it goes. But this is Harry Truman, days after he was born. And just a delightful experience that this was their first son that survived. Now, Martha was 29 when she married John, and John was 30. For women, that was an old age. There was that fear of being an old maid, but also a concern about chances for becoming pregnant and starting a family at that age. John Truman was a feisty little man, 5'6", but he had a reputation as being very honest, made a fortune by today's standards in trading mules, horses, pigs, donkeys, whatever. But he had a fiery temper, and he could just help you regret things that you said, particularly related to politics. And then they moved to Lamar, Missouri, south of Kansas City, where he opened a mule trading barn. And this led to one of the first derogatory slurs on Truman, son of a mule trader. Well, there were thousands of mule traders in 1884. It was an honorable profession. But some Harvard-educated historian thought, oh, let's tell the truth about Harry Truman's origins. So Harry was born in 1884. This is a little house in Lamar. It's still standing. It had an outhouse and a well in the backyard, tiny bedrooms. And then his brother Vivian was born in 1886, and then Mary Jane came along in 1899. Harry had sight problems. They called it in those days flat eyeballs. But basically, if you took Harry Truman's glasses off, he was blind as a bat. He just could not see. But his mother took him to a specialist in Kansas City. They fit him with glasses. And it was strongly said to him, though, you can't play these rough boy games. You can't do that because, if you break your glasses, you could be injured. And so Harry struggled with that dimension of control in his life, but his mother had an alternative idea. One Sunday in 1890, Harry Truman went to the kindergarten class at the First Presbyterian Church, which is still standing. Bess's father built that church. And he saw this beautiful little girl with the most beautiful curls he had ever seen, and it was love at first sight for Harry Truman. Harry Truman was a one-woman man. He never dated anyone, never looked at anyone. A funny experience was that got challenged when he went to meet Stalin in Potsdam. And an army officer thought, Mr. President, you're kind of lonely, I bet, away from your wife and over here and Fräuleins, and if you need some company tonight, I'll arrange it. No one knows what happened to that army officer, but Truman cleaned his plow. You listen here to me. I've only been with one wife, and there's nothing wrong with you. And he never made that same mistake again of an officer suggesting a little companionship late at night for Harry Truman. Now, his mother taught Harry to read using that large family Bible with the big print and the pictures. And then she set him down at the upright piano, and she taught him the basics. Here are the pedals, here are the keys, flats, sharps. And then she said, have at it. And then it became clear that he had musical aptitude. So they arranged for him with a neighbor, Miss Florence Burris, for his first teacher. And finally she said, I've taught this boy everything I know. He needs to see Miss E.C. White in Kansas City. And so Truman had to take the trolley all the way downtown to Kansas City and back. But I want you to look at this. She only charged $2 per lesson. But look at what it is in today's dollars, $64 for a music lesson. But Truman's father believed if the Lord gave you a talent or a skill, it was your requirement to use that. And if Harry had these musical skills, then he ought to. And he got up every morning, 5 a.m., and began practicing for 2 hours. But Martha gave him the most incredible book, and it's The Great Men and Famous Women. Now, that title would not work today, but in 1894 it did, because what's wrong with women being great? And Harry Truman later came to believe that. But it was biographies, and he devoured the book. Truman said that he read every book in the Independence Library. Now, historians are very skeptical about that because they're thinking of libraries like this one. But in Independence, it was one room in a schoolhouse and very limited books. And so I certainly believe that Harry Truman read all of those books. But he was often called on to answer questions about history and about religion. because that was an early area for the individuals who did not go with the Mormons to Salt Lake City, the reorganized Latter-day Saints, and there were lots of religious issues that came up there. But Truman developed this lifelong reading habit. Reading history was far more than a romantic adventure. It was solid instruction and wise teaching, which I somehow felt that I wanted and needed. Now, publishers knew the president was a great reader, so they sent him new books and that sort of thing. And one day, one of the editors of Doubleday went over to visit him. He was visiting Margaret, Harry, and Bess were, and had a stack of books. And it was in the bedroom for some reason, and so this young editor said, "Well, Mr. President, I guess you read yourself to sleep at night." And Harry Truman snapped, "I read to stay awake, young man, and you ought to do the same." But that was his thing. I want to know things. I want to read. Well, 1894 was a horrible time for Harry Truman, diphtheria. While drinking milk, Harry's throat closed in diphtheroid paralysis. And the doctor, of course, very primitive medicine in those days in rural Missouri, said feed him fresh snows. The cold will help him. Harry could not talk, and then he could not walk. His arms and legs were paralyzed. And I want you to imagine this 10-year-old being wheeled about in a baby carriage. He was a frail little guy. And for months, that's what happened. And it took time for him to learn to talk again. But imagine if somebody had walked up, "Oh, you're going to be a future president. I can tell by looking at you." No, that's not what anyone would say. But the Trumans were concerned that this would be some kind of stigma on him, so they hired a wonderful woman teacher to be his tutor, and he even skipped the next grade. But he was lifelong devoted to those female teachers. All, quote, "old maids," because you couldn't be married and be a teacher in Independence, Missouri, but they gave him incredible affection and time. He also worked at Clinton's drugstore, which is still open on the square in Independence, 35 years later or whatever. But Harry often opened up, swept floors, dusted shelves before school. But there was a habit of prosperous businessmen coming in for 10 cents worth of liquor. And Harry knew that some of them were the pillars of the church. And Mondays were not a happy day when these men came in. And then they'd have to stand and watch through the peephole to see if anybody was coming. This is an important lesson that Harry Truman learned, because he called them hypocrites. He said it'd be much more, just be an open drunk and go to any of the saloons on the square and get your drink. Don't sashay in here and give me a dime. But this is where Harry learned that faith is not about what you believe. It's about how you live your life. And that was a lifelong lesson for Truman. Now, there was this popular girl. He had seen her at age, she was 5, he was 6 in the Sunday school. And it's still a children's Sunday school class in Independence, Missouri. It's the name for the Trumans. And she was very athletic, and she didn't really have time for this bookish Harry Truman who wasn't involved in sports. And so Margaret Truman later wrote, she didn't have the slightest interest in this Truman guy, but Truman was stuck on her. And then in 1903, Bessie's father suicided. Now, they were they thought of themselves as aristocratic. The Wallaces, they weren't, but they thought of themselves in a small town in Missouri. And it was a scandal. And so Mrs. Wallace took the children to Colorado Springs for a year of exile. And it changed Bessie's life. She was then called Bessie, because it meant she was going to have to take care of her mother, a very fragile woman, and also her 3 brothers. And that changed the expectations, and we'll come to see that in a few more minutes. After high school, in 1901, they graduated together, and they went their separate ways, and she didn't basically see him for 10 years, till he was visiting his cousins down the street, and a cake plate needed to be returned. And so Harry Truman got that cake plate, bolted down the street, knocked on the door, and the rest is kind of history. Now, Harry had wanted to go to college, but John Truman went bankrupt trading in grain trades and futures, and so there was no money for Harry Truman to go to school. So he worked a variety of jobs. He was timekeeper for a railroad construction crew, and that's where he learned how to use certain words and use them very emphatically, because he had to communicate with this bunch of drunken construction workers. And then he worked in 2 banks, rose very high very quickly, worked with Dwight Eisenhower's brother, and they were in the same boarding house. But in 1906, his dad needed him to quit the bank. And you have to remember, Harry was providing money for his brother and sister to go to school, to quit the bank, to come home, and to work the farm with him. And Harry did that. He agreed to do it, even though it meant losing that incredible rich cultural life of Kansas City. But he was active in Masonic circles and active in the National Guard. And Harry Truman never believed it was going to be permanent. He was not cut out to be a farmer. He had other things in mind. But when his dad died in 1914, suddenly it was very clear, who's going to take care of my sister? Who's going to take care of my mother? This is my fate in life. And it was very clear that Bess Truman was not in the least interested in being a farmer's wife. No way would that happen. I want you to look at these 2 pictures because they're very amazing pictures. Can you imagine if you'd wandered out in that field, and I've wandered those fields, to stop Harry Truman and say, you know, someday you're going to be president of the United States. I know you're plowing, fields right now, but someday you're going to be president. And Harry Truman would say, you got to lay off the liquor. That's what you've got to do. I'm a farmer. But this second picture is one of the unspoken reasons of why Truman was elected in 1948. And I have this picture, this lower picture hanging on my wall, because Truman did his whistle-stop tour across the country. He needed the farm vote, needed it desperately, and so he went to the Iowa plowing fair. And so, naturally, they said, Mr. Truman, how old do you think this mule is? And so Truman looked, opened his mouth, looked at his feet, and said, I think he's this old. And they went, how did you know that? Well, I'm the son of a mule trader, and I know a lot about mules. And then Truman grinned. He said, now, when Mr. Dewey, that real sharp-dressing governor of New York, comes to here, you ask him how old a mule is, and then you compare our answers. And the farmer said, this man is our friend because he can tell the age of mules. Truman joined the U.S. Army, Battery D. Battery D was a rambunctious group that had run off 4 commanders, and Truman said to them, I didn't come over here to get along with you. You are here to get along with me. And let's understand, I am in charge. And they thought he was this little runty little professor with those framed glasses, but he brought them all home to Kansas City. He only lost 1 of the soldiers, and that was due to infection, not due to... And they were in the thick of battle at various times. He finally marries Bess. It had been an 8-year friendship at times, courtship, and Harry moved into his mother-in-law's house. Some historians say that was temporary because he had a business in mind, and he would just stay there for a little while, and but it wasn't free rent, never free rent. He lived there the rest of his life, and Bess lived 10 years after that, and he always paid his share of the expenses. And Harry did not own a house until 1953. Then in 1919 and 20, with all this soldiers coming home from war, the markets were high from all the war spending. He opened with his Jewish friend, Eddie Jacobson, Truman and Jacobson Haberdashery, prime location downtown Kansas City. And they did very well. They sold more pairs of silk underwear to soldiers who just felt, I served over there. I deserve a pair of silk underwear. And so Truman was happy to sell them to him. But they went bust. And Eddie Jacobson took bankruptcy. But Harry Truman, as a Mason, said, I cannot do that. I signed those notes. However irrational it was at times with the war fever, I have to pay those off. He spent the next 12 years paying off his bankruptcy because it was the honest thing to do. In 1922, he was elected judge one of the judges, 3 judges of Jackson County, that is not a judicial appointment. It is a executive. He was like one of these county commissioners or something like that. Terribly crooked outfit, but Harry kind of stayed above all of it. And then there was the birth of Mary Margaret. The Trumans had miscarriages, and so this time they weren't going to risk it, and so they didn't do anything prepare for her coming. She was born, and she had to sleep in a chest of drawers until they figured out what they were going to do with her. And she was the love of Truman's life. These were the 2 deep relationships he had with Margaret and with Bess. He was defeated for re-election. He has a brand new baby. What is he going to do? And he went to work. Very prosperous salesman in AAA. In his early days of AAA in this country, and Harry could sell those memberships. He ran a savings and loan association. He attended law school. And then in 1926, he was elected presiding judge of Jackson County. He won a second term in 1930. And what you need to know is that he remodeled the Independence Courthouse. Jackson County has 2 courthouses and turned it into a colonial structure. And he built a high-rise courthouse, 30 stories tall, in Kansas City for $4 million, brought it in on budget, and it is still in use today. I served jury duty in that building that Harry built. He also built 224 miles of modern roads, and he promised that no farmer would be more than 2 miles from a paved road to get their merchandise. It also affected hospitals and doctors, because now you could get down those roads to a hospital or to a physician or specialist in Kansas City. In 1934, he was elected a New Deal senator, but he got very icy reception, unfortunately. He was seen as the senator from Pendergast, and he was seen as Pendergast's errand boy. But a wise old senator said to him, "Now, Harry, you have 2 choices. You can be a show horse, and you only show up when you want to speak. Or you can be a workout horse behind the scenes and get the jobs done that need to be done." Harry Truman was the poorest of the U.S. senators. To see what he and Bess went through to find apartments they could afford in Washington, the expenses, they had to watch every penny. It was very, very amazing how poor they were. Bess was often back in Independence taking care of her aged mother, but she was his trusted advisor. She kept the contacts with Missouri. In those days, senators didn't have 60, 70 members of a staff. He had Bess, and Bess answered the phone calls, local issues. But she faithfully read the congressional record, which is not the most exciting reading of any day of the week, and she edited Harry's speeches, but she was on his payroll. Now, that was used against Truman in 1944 by a millionaire who kept calling her Payroll Bess. Every campaign stop, Payroll Bess. But a lot of, let's just say economically challenged senators had their wives and family members on their payroll. And Harry Truman said she earned every dollar. Now, in 1940, he was going to run for re-election. Pendergast was in prison. This was not good, because, they go, if Pendergast was a crook and he supported Truman, then Truman's a crook. FDR lied through his teeth to Truman and said, I just can't get involved in primaries. He'd been down in Georgia primarying, doing all this stuff. And Bess had no love for Franklin Roosevelt after that time. But Truman won anyway. And after Pearl Harbor, he was now a colonel in the National Guard, and so he put his uniform on after Pearl Harbor, marched into General Marshall's office, reporting for duty. And General Marshall looked at him and said, "How old are you anyway?" And then he said, "You're too damn old. This is a young man's war. Get out of here." And it hurt Truman's feelings. But if you had said to George Marshall, "Someday he is going to be your commander-in-chief. Maybe you ought to rethink this, George, and you're going to be his Secretary of Defense and his Secretary of State." Then FDR decided to dump Wallace, Henry Wallace, because he was too controversial. And there's all kinds of accounts. You can read for yourself how Roosevelt came to choose Truman as his vice president. And Bess was not amused in the least, and trying to get out of the convention hall, she said to Harry, "Is this the way we're going to live for the rest of our lives?" And Margaret said they drove home from Chicago to Kansas City, and Bess gave him the ice treatment. "Margaret, tell your father to stop," or whatever, and not a happy time for Bess. Okay, now we're going to talk real quickly about myths, because Harry Truman just is a man who attracts myths. And there are people who don't care if it's true, but it's kind of whatever. First, he was a failed haberdasher, and that's true. But you need to remember there was a depression in 1921 and 22, and approximately 100,000 businesses failed, including many that had been opened by military people. And when Harry did not take bankruptcy, many people said, well, at least he's an honest man. He wasn't a good haberdasher, but he is honest. People charged he was unknown. Nobody knew who he was. Well, why did Time magazine put him on the cover of Time magazine? And why did CEOs of defense contractors shiver in their boots when they were called to testify before him when he chaired the Truman Committee on the Conduct of the War? And Truman had the doghouse. If he had the goods on you, you went to the doghouse for a little beverage. And Harry Truman said, "I'm not accusing you of anything, but here's what the evidence says, and you're probably going to jail. Now, you're going to have a chance to testify out here, so if you would like to apologize to the American people for selling the government, bad material, including aluminum in airplanes that were crashing and killing American soldiers." Harry Truman, they were so repentant, you would have thought you were at a Baptist revival with some of those guys. And then there was the claim everything Harry had he owed to Pendergast. Well, why was Harry poor? If he was in on the take, where was the money? That he was an anti-Semite, and I'm going to talk about that in a discussion. He was a racist, they claimed. He was uneducated. He didn't go to college, that's true, but he did come close to graduating from law school. And he was going to finish his law degree like Robert Byrd did at Georgetown University, and he didn't. The most vicious that is circulating now, and I was just in apoplexy, grabbing my chest, watching a meeting of the New York Historical Society when this historian from a certain major New England institution said that he had been a member of the Klan. And you go, and that's only 4 years ago, how dare you say such a thing about Harry Truman? That he was a Baptist who drank and gambled. Now, Harry Truman admitted that he drank and that he gambled, but Baptists could not do that. If a Baptist ran into another Baptist in the liquor store, you couldn't be friendly to him. But if you ran into a Methodist, you could have a good conversation right there. But Truman was like, yeah, I drink, and yes, I love poker. That he was unprepared for the presidency, that he'd only had 2 meetings, and he should have tried harder to meet with Roosevelt to know what was going on. Except anybody that knows the Roosevelt literature knows that Roosevelt did not take people into his confidence. That this is the one that I'm going to really focus on in a few minutes. That Harry Truman knew the Japanese were defeated, and he dropped the atomic bombs anyway. Then a new book that just came out in January, a few weeks ago, says that Truman was bamboozled to start the United Nations. And it's a good thing Truman isn't alive. He and that author would have a come to Jesus experience. They love to say that he was counseled by Billy Graham. That is not true. Billy Graham made several faux pas, and Truman permanently banned him from the White House. And if you have a question about it, I can explain in detail. But what I heard most recently, last year, here in Palm Springs, right here in Palm Springs, that he was evil and that he was a warmonger and he deserved to burn in hell. And I'm going, where did that person get such a notion? Okay, let's start with anti-Semite. Truman's attitude toward Jews evolved. It began when they moved into independence into town from the little farm, and the next door neighbors were Jews, and Truman had to light the lights on Sundays and do all that kind of work for this Jewish family, and he learned to eat and like Jewish food. He had Jewish friends, relied on them, and had a Jewish business partner. very unusual for a Southern Baptist and a Jew to go into business in 1920. That wasn't done very much. And so Truman evolved from those early prejudices. But there are critics that still indict him as an anti-Semite. And they go for what they call the see there passages. I can prove that he was an anti-Semite and that he never allowed a Jew in his house in Independence. Well, that's kind of somewhat technically true, but it wasn't his house. It was his mother-in-law's house, and it wasn't his house till she died in 1953. So his support of Israel was evolved out of this. This was a stunning headline, Los Angeles Times, 2003. We can learn a lot from Harry Truman, the bigot. And this author really went after Harry Truman. It is true that they found Truman's handwritten notes in a book in the Truman Library, and that became the see there. I told you he was an anti-Semite. And Peter Kuznick said that Truman's racism and anti-Semitism may surprise a lot of people today because he's been sanctified by people like David McCullough. And there are Democrats and Republicans who admire his leadership during the Cold War. Now, it is true, in an angry moment, June 1st, 1945, Truman let it rip in his diary when he said the Jews claimed that God Almighty picked him out for special privilege. Well, I'm sure he had better judgment. Fact is, I've never thought that God picked favorites. It's my stated opinion that any race, creed, or color can be God's favorites if they act the part, and very few of them do. And what many of these writers that insist he was anti-Semite, they took the first two sentences. They do not go on and read the rest of the sentence. And so they find a way to indict Harry Truman. But I wish you would think about asking those 900 Jews. The United States only admitted during the war 1,000 Jews, and Roosevelt only agreed because he had to. Churchill was down his throat on it. And they brought 982 people, 900 were Jews, to a military base in Lake Oswego, New York. They were shocked. They woke up the next day. They thought they were coming to freedom, and they're surrounded by guards and barbed wires. They had been hoodwinked. But I want you to look at this picture. I love this picture of these little kids because some of them now would be 80s, almost 90, and ask them if they thought Harry Truman, because Harry Truman and Eleanor said, Roosevelt, we're not sending them back. There's nothing to send them back in Europe. And of course, the horrible racists were saying, they've got to go back. It's the law. It is the law. They have to go back. And Harry Truman said, I'm not sending them back to Europe. So he put them on buses, took them up to Canada, had them cross the border, and hey, you're now home free. And I asked this particular Jewish refugee, Alex Margolis. If you ask him, was Harry Truman an anti-Semite, he would say, what are you talking about? I only am who I am because of Harry Truman. He was one of those young boys. And he went to Harvard Med School, and he had an extraordinary career into his 90s in radiology, in development of the CT scanning. He raised the first money for those kinds of machines. And anytime I have one of those procedures, I always tell, you know where this came from, a guy named Alex Margolis, and you know he was a Jewish refugee to America. And he trained incredible numbers of specialists, like my friend Charlie Higgins, and he had a global impact. So every penny the U.S. government spent on Alex Margolis, they got back with huge returns on their investment. Ask the United Jewish Appeal, 1956, when Harry showed up and said that anti-Semitism in the United States was as grave a challenge to our sense of fairness as was our treatment of Negroes. Now, the myth that Truman was a racist and did not do enough for civil rights. Aboard the funeral train, a lot of Southerners on Roosevelt's funeral train were very concerned. This guy was from Missouri. His grandparents were slave owners on both sides. So what was he going to do about civil rights? And this braggart senator, Burnett Maybank, said, not to worry about old Harry. He knows how to treat, and he filled in the sentence. Now, some critics claim that Truman used the N-word to the end of his life. He did call Adam Clayton Powell, representative, that damned blank, after he said that Bess Truman would always be the second lady because she let the DAR have a reception in the White House. And you don't talk about Bess to Harry Truman. No, no, no. And one night, Truman, and he was alone in the White House a lot. Bess was back taking care of her mother in Independence. After dinner, Harry walked in the kitchen, and all those African-American people just froze. And it's like, what's wrong? Something's wrong. What's wrong? And Truman said, you know, I really enjoyed dinner. Thank you for cooking for me and fixing that wonderful meal. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And he walks out. That was a White House first. No president had never come to a kitchen to thank black chefs and cooks for the meals. And anytime Harry Truman was in a room and here came a king, a potentate, a tycoon, whatever, and say a black staff member brought coffee or tea, Harry Truman said to this person, I want you to meet, and he always introduced every black household member, every black waiter, to whoever he was meeting with. He saw them as people, human beings worthy of respect. And that was probably because Vieta Gar, who was the lifelong Truman cook and friend, over the years she became more than just their cook. She became their friend. And when Margaret Truman began concertizing, she needed a chaperone, and Bess didn't want to travel, so they sent the cook with her. And late one night, Harry Truman was getting ready to go to bed, and Margaret's on the phone crying, baby, what's wrong? They won't let Vietas stay in this hotel. What? They said the blacks can't stay in this hotel. It's for whites only. He said, put the manager of that hotel on the phone right now. And Truman explained the power of the presidency to make life miserable for bigoted hotel owners. And, you know, Mr. President, we just found a room. Oh, of course, this is all, And Truman used a word from his farm experience, and Margaret had a good night's sleep, and so did Vieta. Now, there was some racial baggage, and I strongly disagree with Carol Anderson. We really disagreed when she was a member of the Truman Board of the Truman Presidential Library, because her point was, well, okay, he could have done more. Well, everybody could have done more in 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50. And you're trying to blame him. Look how much he did. And it's presentism. And that's what I see with a lot of people today. They take our present sensitivities and they impose them on Truman. He should have, he could have, all this. And of course, you can find racial, aha moments. Look at this one. Uncle Will says the Lord made a white man from dust, a blank from mud, and then he threw what was left and it came down as a Chinaman. Uncle Will, does hate Japs and Chinese. So do I. I guess it's racial prejudice. But I'm strongly of the opinion that Negroes ought to be in Africa, yellow men in Asia, and white men in Europe and America. Now, I want you to look at the date of this letter, 1911. So these historians drag this out. And, it's another 34 years before he was president. They go, see there, I told you he was a racist. This is what he said. And you go, boy, wouldn't we like to go through your correspondence? And you know why some first ladies burned their husbands' papers? Because there were some challenging letters. Historian William Lutenberg says that Truman had a conversion sometime during the presidency. But Brian Burns, who's a Kansas City historian, said, no, not at all. He had his conversion during the time he was a judge. He was genuinely interested in African Americans in Jackson County. And after he was elected the chief judge of Jackson County, he had a lot more power to act. And he supported budgets for county homes for elderly blacks, the kind of concept we used to call the poorhouse, where old people were sent. He built a home for young Negro men that couldn't seem to find their footings. And he built a hospital. Yes, it was segregated because it was 1926 in Missouri for Negro patients. And he was pressured constantly during the Depression for jobs. It got to where he hated going anywhere because somebody's saying, I need a job, my son-in-law, my brother-in-law needs a job. And there were, in 1928, at the start of the Depression, 330 Negroes on the Jackson County payroll. So Truman was pressured, get rid of the blacks because white men need those county jobs. And Truman said no, or a close derivative of no that I can't say in the Rancho Mirage Library. And then he lobbied extensively for blacks to be hired at war factories in Kansas City, and even down in Kansas at Fort Riley, even though that was not the state he represented in Congress. During his 1940 reelection campaign, he started his campaign, opened his campaign in Sedalia, Missouri. Klanners were in the audience that day. He knew the audience was basically white. And Harry Truman, without mincing words, said, I believe in the brotherhood of man, not merely the brotherhood of white men. That was 1940. That was a radical thought that sent his colleagues, Democratic Southern colleagues in the Senate, off their rockers. They were just screaming. It's a wonder some of them didn't have heart attacks. And he said, the majority of Negro people find but cold comfort in shanties and tenements. Surely as freemen, they're entitled to something better than this. Then once Truman was president, the problem was African Americans who had fought against Germany in particular came home, and they believed, having fought for the United States against the Nazis, they were entitled to privileges even south of the Mason-Dixon line. Now, Isaac Woodard was a decorated Army sergeant. He was still in uniform. He had been discharged, but there was a clothing shortage in those days for soldiers, so he was still wearing his military uniform. He needed to use the bathroom, and he asked the white driver to let him stop and use the restroom. And I, again, won't be able to tell you what the driver said to him. They pulled into Batesville. The soldier, Isaac Woodard, was arrested. He was beaten, charged with disorderly conduct, and his eyes were gouged out by a blackjack. And he was denied medical treatment for 24 hours. So there could have been some effort to save his life, but the sheriff, the police chief would do nothing. And so the staff briefed Harry Truman. There's nothing that can be done under current federal laws. You can propose a law that would, but under current laws, there's nothing that you can do. The National Association of Colored Women's Clubs picketed the White House. And then a guy named Walter White, who organized the National Emergency Council Against Mob Violence. And he met with Truman in the Oval Office. And they kept urging him to do something, to do something. Now, Truman was kind of familiar with Isaac Woodard, but not really. So finally, Walter White decided he needed to be graphic and specific. And he began describing the Southern justice that this decorated Army sergeant received. And it was said that Truman began to set riveted and began to be visibly shaken. One attendee described the president's face as wrapped in horror. And then Truman exploded, "This shit has to stop." Now, several of these people visiting Truman were ministers. And so they can't go out and say that Truman said shit, So they said, he said this problem has to be solved. But Truman had a black aide named, oddly, Truman Gibson. And Truman Gibson wrote the account, and this is the quotation from Truman Gibson. And it was an incredible, incredible moment. Truman said, "My very stomach turned when I learned that Negro soldiers, just back from overseas, were being dumped out of Army trucks and beaten. And when the mob gangs can take these people out and shoot them in the back, and everybody in the surrounding county is acquainted with who did the shooting, and nothing is done, we're in a pitiful fix." Now, I need to tell you, this was coming from Harry Truman's World War I experience. when he was a captain, and he saw black soldiers put in highly dangerous so that white soldiers would not have to fight there. And he saw that white men would not take orders from black sergeants. And it was just set in Harry Truman's mind. He couldn't do anything about it in 1919, but he could in 1945. The aides, of course, cautioned him, don't go there, Mr. Truman. Don't go there. You don't need to go there. There's an election coming up, and, the voters are already pretty upset about rationing and da-da-da. And we can kick this down the can down the road, and we'll deal with it after you're reelected. And Truman was emphatic, I have to do something now, not down the road. And then the second instance happened with Maceo Snipes. He was a veteran, and he believed he ought to come back to Georgia and be able to vote. He had earned that right by being a soldier. And he walked into Taylor County polling station, cast a ballot. Next day, there was a knock on his door. When he answered the door, 4 men shot him. Now, the problem was, in rural Georgia, the white hospitals would not accept a black man. They argued, we have no black blood for a transfusion. And so he suffered enormously, and he died. And Snipes' family was so chagrined by the treatment, they buried him in an unmarked grave and left the county. And Truman was not pleased about that at all. And then the third one that really upset Truman was in June 25, when 4 blacks were executed by a mob in Monroe, Georgia. And one person boasted to the New York Times, until George went into the army, he was a good end. But when he came out, he thought they were as good as any white people. We had to show him that wasn't true. And one of these women was pregnant, so they killed. Just horrible for Truman to begin to imagine. So then he signed the executive order, which created the President's Committee on Civil Rights. And he told that committee, I want to see how far we can go. In June of 1947, Truman was invited to speak at the NAAC's annual convention in Washington, D.C. Those invitations came to presidents, but they never accepted them because, well, that wouldn't sit well in the South if you're running for re-election. But Truman accepted, and they couldn't believe he's going to show up. And show up he did, knowing that his 94-year-old mother, an unreconstructed Confederate back in Missouri, was listening to the radio broadcast. And he may have been President of the United States, but he's still Martha's son. And that hot Sunday, 10,000 people had stood there for hours in suits and ties waiting for the president. And Abe Lincoln at the Lincoln Memorial looked down on Truman and the crowd. And the crowd was looking up at Abe. What was this white man whose grandparents had been slave owners, what was he going to say? Truman was emphatic, we cannot wait another decade or another generation to remedy these evils. We must work as never before to cure them now. And then he said the extension of civil rights today means not protection of the people against the government, but protection of people by the government. And then he drove home knowing millions of people were listening. When I say all Americans, I mean all Americans. And Truman was afraid people thought that was just PR, so he went down that row of famous people sitting behind him on the platform and said, I mean all Americans, no exceptions. Okay, I'm going to have to hurry because, and then, he ran against Strom Thurmond, Governor Thurmond, in 1948, and Thurmond was a very confusing man. And so they asked him, you're the Dixiecrat, you walked out of the Democratic National Convention, and Harry Truman's only saying the things that FDR said. They're just empty promises. And Strom Thurmond said, I know it, but Harry Truman means it. And boy, I don't have time to go into it, but Truman gave him some real issues that he could think about. State of the Union, he said the same thing. We are going to talk about rights. And the people that applauded him warmly sat on their hands. It got very chilly. And if you listen to the tape, it's noticeable because there were places Truman paused thinking he was going to get applause. There was silence. And so Truman went, whoa, maybe this was too much. Then he threw the gauntlet down because there had been a lynching. And I need to tell you, and I don't want to be graphic about this, but lynchings were ticketed events. Railroads gave special excursion fares. And some of these drew 10,000 people, including children. They made pictures and sold them as postcards. So this wasn't just a moment of anger. They also did unbelievable acts of violence to the genitalia of these men. Set them afire, did all kinds of... So it wasn't just hanging them by the neck. Sometimes they'd cut them down so more people could pull them up. And Truman was said, that day is over in this country. Roosevelt never would speak out against it because he said, I need the Southern Democratic votes. Truman, not so. And then he passed the executive order to desegregate the military. And I love this quote. An 11-year-old boy in Harlem that July day could not have imagined how his future would be shaped by Truman's action. If you look at that face real clearly, you're going to see that face again in just a moment. And he said, being president means sometimes you have to put aside your personal political ambitions and prejudices to do what is best for the country. Can you imagine a politician today saying such a thing? And he was willing to go to the mat. And he said, I may only get my vote, but I will know I voted correctly. 82% of Americans opposed his actions. And here is Colin Powell. The Army was the only place when I was coming out of college, the only institution in all of America, because of Harry Truman, where a young black kid could now dream. It was the sole place on the American landscape where the color of your guts and the color of your blood was more important than the color of your skin. And if you had said to that ROTC cadet, oh, someday you're going to be chair of the Joint Chiefs, you're going to be Secretary of State, he would look at you like, oh, boy, you are out of your mind. And Truman, just to kind of up the ante, appointed William Hastie to be governor of, let's see, I'm sorry, I'm missing this on the line, of the Virgin Islands. And there was the National Governors Conference that met every year, and that year was meeting in South Carolina, and suddenly Strom Thurmond realized, we can't have a black man in the governor's mansion. Well, all your servants are black. Yeah, I know, but we can't have this. And Truman just nearly blew a gasket over that. And so he decided to appoint him to the Third Court of Appeals. All right, now we're going to talk about the atomic bomb. And I'm going to have to hurry. I'm sorry, I just could go on and on. But let's talk about the atomic bomb because this is the 80th anniversary. There is this myth that keeps getting reproduced. Several printings of books seem to insist on it, of saying that Harry Truman knew the Russians were defeated and that it was to punish them and also to intimidate the Russians. And for a lot of people, a lot of history books that junior highs and senior highs are reading, it's kind of like they dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima 3 days later on Nagasaki. The war ended, everybody came home, and everybody was happy about the whole thing. But as Phillips Payson O'Brien says, Irish scholar, from the moment the bombs exploded, there's been a debate which shows no signs of abating about the decision to cross the atomic threshold, whether the act was necessary, ethical, or counterproductive. And he said there's no easy answer in this debate, as there was no easy answer at the time. But I read people who believe it's a black and white issue, and they don't bother reading the data to see what it is. And yes, there are those passages, and we call these people the revisionist. And I hope this doesn't sound unpleasant, but a lot of them were hippies, quite frankly, during the Vietnam War. They were anti-war, so they were anti-any war. They weren't so anti the American Revolution, because that gave them America. But the thing was, they did not have access to many of the Jewish records. They didn't have access to the Japanese records, and they certainly didn't have access to the Soviet archives. So suddenly, in the later days, since the 80s, these documents have been published. And Ken Burns, the great storyteller, says everything exists in a complicated state of gray. Okay, let me try to hurry this. John Kennedy wrote his parents, when I read that we'll fight the Japs for years, if necessary, and sacrifice hundreds of thousands if we must, always check from where he's talking. It's seldom out here in the Pacific. And predicting when the war would end was based on guesstimations. Nobody knew. And yet the revisionists call these people liars, where you were the Secretary of State, the Admiral in the Navy, you were a liar because these guesstimations couldn't have been true. But Harry Truman was insistent. General George Marshall told me that if we had to invade Japan, it would cost 500,000 American lives to force the enemy's surrender on his home ground. Let me hurry ahead. You need to know that Truman was a neighbor. All those years as a county judge, he knew families, and I've talked to members of those families. Truman coming and sitting at their dining room table and going to receptions with Harry Truman, all this stuff. And he knew their boys. He knew their boys very well. And this is what he wrote best in August after the 2 atomic bombs had been exploded. I'll say that we'll end the war a year sooner, and think of the kids who now won't be killed. We now have more records looking into what the Japanese were thinking. And this is what Japanese Minister Amani said: it would be better for 100 million Japanese to die as one than to agree to a surrender that would allow the Allies to occupy Japan. And he said all of the sacrifices of war we've made thus far would be of no value. They were sacrifices for nothing. And then General Curtis LeMay came along and said, I can handle this. And so he started these massive bombing raids on Tokyo and on surrounding cities. And he used incendiary bombs. He stripped the planes down to get a maximum load of weaponry on them. Critics ignore the fact that 83,000 were killed in 3 days in the general's bombing. 83,000, 40,000 wounded, and 1 million were left homeless by these bombings. Now, they will talk about the deaths in Hiroshima. They will talk about the deaths in Nagasaki. And then you begin to count all the bombing campaigns in the United States over Japan. You're seeing a massive amount. 60 Japanese cities were bombed off the map. The Navy was saying, leave it to us. We know what we're doing. We'll blockade Japan. We'll starve them to death. And then you go, well, okay, can we talk about Japanese civilians, little children starving to death? And the rice crop had been awful in 45. Japanese were starving. And the admiral has said, we can starve more of them until they come to their senses. The problem, Admiral, is that American sailors are going to be victims of kamikaze flights. And the Japanese had already put aside 5,000 planes to attack American ships. And for Japanese young men, they were going to die as a pilot. Some of them didn't want to, but they had no choice. Case in point was the Lexington, which was sunk. 950 men died. My uncle survived, but the sharks were an issue that those young boys had to deal with. And so, to understand, Douglas MacArthur, the great ego general, he wanted to invade because, he hated Eisenhower. And so he wanted to one-up Eisenhower. You think Normandy was something? Wait till I have my chance. I'm going to do all this stuff. And several people were rather aware that MacArthur wasn't kind of all there. 2 invasions, November of 1945 and Olympic. It was going to be 750,000 U.S. soldiers. In February of 1946, they were going to invade the Japanese proper, and it was going to be 1 million soldiers. The rule of thumb was 1 in 3 casualties. Whatever you sent in, the casualties, not death necessarily, there'd be a lot of deaths, but there would be a wounding of all these young men. And the Japanese knew where the Americans were going to come in. So Hoover gets involved. Remember Herbert Hoover, the Great Depression? He decides he's a war expert as a Quaker. And so he said, we need to rescind that unconditional surrender. We just said, let's soften it and let the Japanese off easier, and they won't be humiliated. And Truman was about to have a coronary with Hoover. And Truman just announced the terms have not changed. And so it was very clear we were going to lose perhaps 500,000 casualties, not deaths, but casualties, and some of them dramatic casualties. I'm going to skip over this to get to it. But you need to know the new research, and I want to recommend a book to you called Hiroshima, The Final Witnesses, excuse me. It is a horrendous book to read, brand new, by a Japanese-American scholar who spent his academic career interviewing survivors of the bombings. And Nagasaki will come out in August. But he documents the extent to which the Japanese were using children. They had closed schools. They put these malnourished children in plants, in all kinds of industrial plants, and they put them digging firewalls and fire breaks in Tokyo. That's why so many children were killed in the atomic bomb, because they dropped it in those areas where the children were working. But they also decided on a campaign for primitive weapons, and they taught women, and you can see the Poles. The Japanese were going to fight to the final moment to protect their emperor, who was a god. Harry Truman didn't see it that way, but the Japanese did. Japanese had never surrendered in 2,600 years of history, and the Japanese leaders boasted that every mobilized citizen was going to fight to the death. And the casualties might reach 28 million. It's hard for us to comprehend that dimension. And this is a record that I stumbled onto recently that illustrates these guesstimations. They decided, given the casualty rates, they needed to order 500,000 more Purple Hearts. The U.S. government is still using those Purple Hearts that did not prove necessary. They refurbished them, but 500,000 Purple Hearts. So the numbers were being taken seriously. But I want you to see this picture, very disturbing. It bothered Truman enormously, the abuse of American POWs. There were about 100,000, and there were also some some Europeans. And the order went out that if America invaded, those POWs were to be executed by whatever means possible. These pictures are horrible, and you don't see them very often. But what those men went through to survive, and the great fear of families was, they were almost free. The Americans were going to invade, would have freed them, and the Japanese killed them anyway at the last. Okay, there's a lot of stuff that gets told by revisionists about, the Japanese were so sorry. They were so sorry. And so they were appealing to the Swiss. They were appealing to the Russians. The Russian archives does not demonstrate that. But they wanted to surrender on their own terms. They were beaten, yes, but they weren't willing to surrender. Here's the 5 conditions. Japan would keep Emperor Hirohito. About 60% of Americans wanted to see Hirohito executed, in public. That the Japanese would disarm their own forces. We don't need you. We will disarm these soldiers. Japan would conduct any so-called war crime trials. Guess how that justice was going to work. There would be no Allied occupation of Japan. They would admit defeat, but not surrender. And Truman said, you got to be out of your ever-loving minds. We're not doing that. Okay, let me get over here. I just want to say that 85% of Americans approved the bombs. Now, that has steadily declined, but even today, if you look at age groups, the statisticians say many people in this room would say it was the right decision based on age. Their grandchildren do not believe that, but they believe it because they were alive during that time. The issue came up, what if they had spent $2 billion, and I can't remember exactly how much that is in 2024 dollars, a lot. What if there were these incredible deaths and maiming of U.S. soldiers, and then the American public understood there had been a bomb that could have been used and prevented the blockade? Harry Truman said, I would be impeached, and General Groves, who headed the program, would be court-martialed. I just want to read a couple of these, and then I'm going to skip to the very end, and we got time for questions. I knew I was dead because there was no way to survive Operation Olympic, the planned invasion of Japan. When I learned that a single bomb had destroyed Hiroshima, it was the happiest day of my life. It was like getting a new life. Every day I've said a prayer for Harry Truman. I can't tell you how I felt because there were no words to express my feelings. First, it was a feeling of, well, I've made it. They won't get another chance at me here. Then I had a quiet feeling of thankfulness way down inside the feeling that the lights have come on again. With God's help and a little luck, the boys will all come marching home. This is Mitch McConnell's father. And this is Mitch McConnell, who had polio and could not walk. And for him, his dad coming home was an incredible experience. When the atomic bombs dropped and news began to circulate that Operation Olympic would not take place, we would not be obligated to run up the beaches near Tokyo, assault firing while being mortared and shelled. For the fake manliness of our fake age, we cried with relief and joy. We were going to live. We were going to grow up to adulthood after all. And you must remember how many 17-year-olds fought in World War II. Truman accepted responsibility for the bomb. He did not try to pass it off. The generals convinced me. Truman said, I regarded the bomb as a military weapon, never had any doubt that it ought to be used. I think we saved 250,000 of our youngsters from being killed. And one thing I have found amazing in reading Truman's letters at the library in Independence, the Times best wrote him, so-and-so's boy, you remember him, died. So-and-so's brother-in-law died. So-and-so's father died. So these were not just statistics to Truman. These were people who were dying. But he certainly could not have imagined the nuclear club today. And in case you haven't seen the newest issue of Foreign Policy, it is calling for the South Koreans to be armed to the hilt. That is the only way, given change in politics in America, the South Koreans will be able to survive. I'm like, I can't believe what I'm reading. Okay, let me get over here. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to skip over Israel. Maybe you'll invite me back sometime. I'll do Israel. I'll do Korea. I'm sorry, you write down and you talk too much. But I do want to talk, and you got whiplash. I know I was not supposed to do that. But in January 21st, Harry Truman came home as first citizen, and he paid his own train fare home. There was none of this get an Air Force One, fly home. He retired on a $113 a month pension. Now, admittedly, that was worth more in those days, but there was no presidential pension, there was no Senate pension, none of that stuff. So $113 a month. There was no Secret Service protection. That did not happen till Lyndon Johnson, after Kennedy was assassinated, ordered the Secret Service to protect the Trumans. And Bess said, well, they're not coming on my property. I'm telling you right now. And Lyndon Johnson said, Ms. Truman, I've got so many things on my mind right now. And I just can't worry about you and Harry, some crazy person taking a shot. Well, all right, Mr. President, all right. And when she died, Secret Service agents had been sitting in her home for 10 years. And there was no money for office expenses. If you wrote a letter to Truman, and in that era, he believed you needed a letter back. It was his stamp that he put on it. He did get a $600,000 advance for memoirs, but there was a provision that intellectual property was taxed outrageously. He paid $150,000 in taxes on that, and he actually cleared $37,000. When the manuscript was finished, it was typewritten, he looked at it and wrote on the top, what a bunch of crap. And that's kind of what he thought. But now, for sale, right now there's a special sale going on. You can get a signed copy for $2,950. And some of you may go online and see if you can get a copy of that. I'd like to, but I don't. He opened the Presidential Library in Independence. And the reason it was in Independence because his brother wouldn't allow good farmland to be sold for some damn library. He wasn't into books. And Truman raised the money himself. He raised the money. And it cost $1.7 million, and he thought it was outrageous. And it had lunch with the daughter of the man who built the library. And she said, oh, yeah, he thought that price was outrageous. But he often greeted visitors, gave tours, sometimes answered the phone. This is the old man himself. What can I help you with? And you may not know this, it's unique in presidential libraries. Under the library is a replica of the Oval Office. And every school day, about 100 juniors and seniors from schools across Missouri, Kansas, Iowa, Nebraska come. They hand them leather-bound books. These are the documents. You're the Secretary of State. You are the Secretary of War. You're the Secretary of Treasury. Here are the documents. What would you do? And they're working with Harry Truman's documents. And they come back. I've been through it. I'm just absolutely thrilled. These young people debating the atomic bomb. I mean, they went at it. But they had documents, and it's one of the greatest programs for the Truman. Then LBJ came down to Independence to give Medicare Card 1 and 2 to Harry and Bess. And he called Truman the real daddy of Medicare. And Truman proposed it in 45, 47, and 49. And the exact same arguments by the American Medical Association that were used on Barack Obama were all borrowed from what they said about Harry Truman in 19... They couldn't even come up with new stuff, for God's sake. All right, this is Truman, and I'm going to be almost through, and then we're going to take questions. I'll always remember an epitaph, which is in a cemetery in Tucson, Arizona. Here lies Jack Williams. He done his damnedest. I think that's the greatest epitaph a man can have, when he gives everything that is in him to do the job that is before him. That's all you can ask of him, and that is what I've tried to do. What I love about this picture is that Harry Truman was always very neat, wore tailor-made suits, very trim, never gained weight, walked and swam every day. And here he is showing his vulnerability, walking up and down the streets of Independence. And I've talked to people who, one woman said, I was a 14-year-old girl, and this man in a suit every day tipped his hat to me and said, "Good morning, young lady. Hope you're going to have a good day at school." And she said, "I got my self-confidence from Harry Truman. He didn't know who I was. I was just a mixed-up junior high school student, and he loved me." All right, Truman dies, and this is where he's buried. Wonderful ceremonies on the 8th of May every year. I miss them being out here in the desert and can't go back for them. Very simple graves. Truman wanted to be buried in the center of his library, so if he felt like the need to work, he could just get up and go inside and work a few hours and then come back. Okay, can we have the lights? I don't know if there's a microphone. I can't quite see. Oh, there is. Here it comes. TJ. I don't think there'd be an Israel had it not been for Harry Truman. And he was very clear the Brits were in it for the oil, and Truman said, they can't drink their damn oil. They'll keep selling it to us. And even when General Marshall challenged him, it'll take 100,000 U.S. soldiers to defend him. They'll drive him into the sea. Harry said, let them try. Let them try, and you know the results of it. And he's beloved in Israel. It was not politically expedient, but he did the right thing because he read the Bible and he read the book of Deuteronomy. And God said, I will bless those that bless you and I will curse those. And Harry Truman was a literalist when it came to the Bible. If that's what God said, that's what God meant. Okay, some questions. Okay, this is going to be difficult. Oh, my colleague. Fire away.
Dr. Smith, you want to talk at all about the assassination attempt on Harry Truman? I know you went.
Thank
and
you.
What happened?
Yes. October 31st, 1951, I believe that's right. The White House was being rebuilt totally from inside. The Republicans wanted to level the place and start over, and Bess Truman said, no way, this is a historical monument, and they hollowed the inside, went down, and rebuilt it. But he was living in the Blair House. If you don't know this, it's very stupid, but the Blair House had a bus stop right there. So you could get off, and there's the president living there, 30 feet away, and there's a bus stop. And of course, when Truman would walk to the office, Oval Office, which he did, people would stop and yell, hey, Harry, and then they started timing the lights. And it just got totally wild. And Truman said, cut out the lights. I'm just a man walking to my work. But Puerto Rican nationalists attempted to shoot their way in to the Blair House. Harry Truman was in his underwear. He was taking a nap, and the shooting started, and Truman sticks his head out the window. "What's going on out there?" And I can't tell you exactly what the Secret Service said to him, but get back inside, and they killed Leslie Coffelt, who was not a Secret Service agent, it was White House. And Harry Truman was devastated. And he said, he went to Arlington for the committal service, and he said, "Do you know what it means that a man gave his life for you, stepped into a bullet for the likes of me?" And it bothered him enormously. He hired the widow to work at the White House. And they were kind of misguided, but eventually Harry Truman communicated their sentence rather than the death sentence to life in prison, and then Jimmy Carter commuted their sentences, and they went back to Puerto Rico. But a fascinating story, and Truman was a fatalist. He believed when it's your time to go, you're going. And he always said in World War I, there's no bullet that had my name on it. And he said that day, such things as this are to be expected. And then he went on with his afternoon and went to the Arlington National Cemetery to dedicate a monument to General Dill. And there were probably other assassination attempts that he did not know about or did not publicize. But it was an incredible moment that he would say, these guys were misguided. They don't need to die for trying to shoot me. Another question. Yes, right down here. There's a phone.
Reasons that FDR, don't need it. What are some of the reasons that FDR chose Harry as a running mate?
Okay, that could be a separate lecture, actually, because Roosevelt decided he wanted to be an actor and staged this big thing. Some of the language is pretty rough. But Truman had no enemies. You know, he was in the middle of the country. He had been a very important U.S. senator, saved the country $15 billion. As I said, he was on the cover of Time magazine, very well regarded, and yet he had no enemies. Labor liked him, blacks liked him, the Jews liked him, so it was kind of an easy thing. And Roosevelt was always looking toward the election results, and he knew Wallace would sink him. But he thought Truman would be very, very good. Now, Bess had no use for Roosevelt, and he didn't want to even be around the guy because he lied so much. And he lied about Harry, and of course that was the unforgivable sin for Bess Truman. But yeah, he was a workhorse. You know, he gave us the first civil aeronautics legislation. He did the railroad reform. He gets no credit for those, but he was very big on flying and all those kind of things. So that had a lot to do with him. And Roosevelt didn't see him as a threat. You know, he's Harry, and he was not going to threaten Roosevelt. Good question, though. Yes, right here. Let's put on the, yeah.
Mr. President Truman always used the middle initial S,
That's
which
right.
I read that stood for nothing.
That's right.
And that's why he never added a period
That's
after.
right.
That's true.
Yeah, and you put me, one set of relatives, grandparents was Ship, and the other was also with S, and I'm sorry, I can't remember right now. But it was a problem when he took his oath of office in the White House. They couldn't find the Bible, and finally they found the Bible. And Harry Truman actually held the Bible and then kissed the Bible when he took his oath. But Judge Harlan kind of goes, Harry Ship Truman. And Truman goes, I, Harry S. Truman. And yeah, but he was, you know, in that family, you didn't want to upset either set of grandparents, so S just kind of worked well. And there is a debate. The Library of Congress has said it gets no period, but yet even documents from the Truman Library have S period on it. And I've tried to honor that, but not always successful. They get through because you see what you think you're seeing there. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yes.
My understanding is that Harry Truman in 1944 44, I guess 44, the end of, just before FDR's last election, was head of a committee, Senate committee, investigating government contractors who had made an enormous amount, abnormal personal compensation out of government contracts.
Yeah.
And he was doing an excellent job. He got a call from the White House. The president would like to see you. He had never met Roosevelt. Yeah. He had no idea that Roosevelt had any sense of who he was, even. He went there, and Roosevelt said, I've been watching you, seeing what you're doing, and that I would like you to agree to be my vice presidential candidate in the next election. And I guess Harry just couldn't believe it. How could that have happened? Anyway, I think that's the story I've read.
Okay.
I don't know if it's true or not.
You're quoting pretty much the Roosevelt scholars version. The Truman's version, the Truman version took place in a motel room, I think, whatever time it was. Roosevelt did not come to the 44 convention. He claimed he had war responsibilities. He was in a train in San Diego. So they set this thing up, and he goes, have you got that fellow lined up yet? And, of course, he was yelling on the phone because Roosevelt did. And the head of the Democratic Party said, no, I told you he's the damnedest cuss in Missouri. Well, you tell that guy if he wants to lead to the defeat in war to go right ahead. And Truman said, well, damn, why didn't you tell me before now? So the people in the motel room say it was, damn, why didn't you tell me before now? One person said it was even a little stronger than damn. It was a certain body function. But it's like, I would just say with these, I realized you could say I've been hard on revisionists today because they've beat me up. And so I'm just going to do turnabout. They pick stories that are favorable to their point of view. The revisionists knew what they were going for from the start. And just like Roosevelt scholars knew what they were going for. And he didn't really know Truman. And he once said, well, I hardly even know the fella. But Roosevelt was such a schemer, such an absolute schemer. Now historians go, he was lying through his teeth. You couldn't count on anything he actually said being actually true on many issues. Yeah.
We might have time for just one more question.
Okay, right here I think there's one, right in the center.
I understand, if I recall correctly, he lived in New York in later years. And I remember him being very famous for his constitutionals, walking up the streets and down the streets, Fifth Avenue and Madison Avenue, and in the streets of New York, and everybody wanting to greet him and congratulate him.
Actually, he did not live there. Bess wanted to live there. But Margaret, after she married, lived there. And so they had to go see the grandchildren. And it was kind of funny because Truman was reading Plato and Socrates to these 3- and 4-year-old boys. And Margaret said, Daddy, and he goes, oh, this could be very useful for them in future days. But he liked going to New York. He liked going to Washington, too. He did the famous drive. He bought a new car, and Bess and him decided to drive up Highway 24 out of Missouri and to drive to Washington. And it got chaotic because people driving along, you go, man, that guy looks just like Harry Truman. And I think it is Harry Truman. Motels were side of the road in those days. And one night, Bess had not liked the motel choice, but Harry said, I'm tired of driving, we're going to sleep here tonight. And so in the middle of the night, there's all this commotion, sirens going, and Bess said, I told you there's a bad section of town, we shouldn't have stayed here. So Truman goes to the door in his undershorts and says, what's going on? And the sheriff walks over and said, well, somewhere Harry Truman's staying in this hotel somewhere. and oh, that's why you fellows are here. Well, you're doing a good job. Anyway, laughing, he's staring face to face. Let me tell one last story and I'm through. Herbert Hoover said the Trumans had an open lawn and people would pick Bess's flowers and, do all kinds of things. They've eaten dinner and there's people that are stealing flowers or borrowing flowers. And so finally Herbert Hoover said, you got to put a fence around that place. People steal the boards off the wall. It was, a frame building. And so they put up an iron gate and they thought that was security. What nobody knew that Truman's grandson told me, that gate was never locked. People just assumed. Well, one of the stories I dearly love, one day Truman would walk down and get the morning paper at the gate, walk back up and read it. So one morning he was bending down and a car screeched to a halt. And this guy gets up, where's that blankety blank Truman? And Truman goes, you're looking at him. No, Truman didn't say that. He goes, that house right down, the third house down. And so this guy tears off and is screaming all this filthy language. And he said, my neighbor was not amused, but I thought it was hilarious to be this close, and he didn't know me. You have been wonderful. Thank you for coming today. Thank you. Thank you. And if you'll let me do one plug for my book, which is not here. If you go to Amazon, it's called Almost Everything Worth Knowing About Harry Truman. It's not your traditional book. It's 600 multiple choice questions. Because some people don't read. But these multiple choice questions really cover all of Truman's life, almost everything worth knowing about Harry Truman. Thank you so much, Rancho Mirage Library. Thank you. Thank you.